March 14th, 1945. Captain James Harrigan was about to die, and he knew it. His P-51D Mustang, call sign Redtail 7, was doing 430 miles per hour in level flight at 18,000 feet over the Rhine Valley. That should have been fast enough. Against Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt 109s, 430 was a death sentence for the Luftwaffe. But Harrigan wasn't being chased by a propeller-driven fighter. The Messerschmitt ME-262 screaming up behind him was doing 540 miles per hour, and it wasn't even trying hard. Jets didn't try. They just killed you. Harrigan had maybe 20 seconds before that German pilot lined up his 30mm cannons and turned his Mustang into confetti. He'd already pushed his throttle through the war emergency power gate, the setting that gave you 5 minutes of maximum performance before your engine grenaded itself from the stress. But war emergency power in a stock P-51D gave you 440 miles per hour, maybe 450 if you were lucky, and diving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The jet behind him was gaining like Harrigan was standing still. Then Harrigan remembered something a crew chief had told him 3 days ago. Something about spark timing and a modification that wasn't exactly approved but had kept Lieutenant Morrison alive when an ME-262 jumped him over Frankfurt. The crew chief, a sergeant with grease under his fingernails and an attitude about regulations that made officers nervous, had said, "If you're going to die anyway, flip this toggle." Harrigan looked down at his left console, where someone had installed a small unmarked switch that definitely hadn't been there when he'd taken delivery of this Mustang 4 months ago. He flipped it. The Packard Merlin, engine behind him, screamed. Not the normal howl of a V12 at high power, but something different, higher pitched, angrier. The manifold pressure gauge that had been sitting at 67 inches jumped to 74. The cylinder head temperature gauge redlined immediately, and the airspeed indicator, which had been frozen at 440, started climbing. 445, 450, 455. The ME-262 was still gaining, but not as fast now. Harrigan held the toggle switch, watching his engine temperature gauges threaten to go supernova, and thought about whoever had modified his fighter in ways that would probably get them court-martialed. Then he stopped thinking about regulations and started thinking about living, because at 462 miles per hour, he was matching the jet, and at 468, he was pulling away. The German pilot, who'd probably been settling in for an easy kill, watched in disbelief as the American fighter he'd been closing on started opening the gap. Jets didn't get outrun by propeller fighters. That wasn't how physics worked. But Harrigan's Mustang was doing exactly that, pulling away at a rate that made no sense unless you understood what was happening inside that engine. Something that involved spark timing advanced so far beyond Packard's specifications that it turned a racing engine into something that belonged on a drag strip, not a fighter plane. Harrigan held that modification for 90 seconds, long enough to open the gap to 3 miles, and drop down into cloud cover where the jet couldn't follow without risking controlled flight into terrain. When he finally released the toggle and felt his engine settle back to normal power, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, though there'd been plenty of that. From the realization that someone had figured out how to make a P-51 outrun a jet, and had done it quietly enough that it wasn't in any official documentation. Back at base, Harrigan found the crew chief who'd installed the modification. Staff Sergeant Anthony DeMarco, 24 years old, from Providence, Rhode Island, with a background in modified stock car racing that had given him an education in making engines do things their designers never intended. Harrigan's question was simple. How? DeMarco's answer would eventually rewrite fighter tactics for the last 3 months of the war in Europe. And it started with understanding why the ME-262 was supposed to be unbeatable in the first place. The Messerschmitt ME-262 was a nightmare wrapped in aviation aluminum and powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, and when it showed up over Germany in late 1944, it changed the air war overnight. Allied fighters that had owned the skies suddenly found themselves facing an aircraft that was 100 miles per hour faster, could climb like a rocket, and packed four 30mm cannons that could shred a B-17 inches a single pass. The ME-262's top speed was around 540 miles per hour in level flight. A P-51D Mustang, the best American fighter in Europe, could manage about 440 miles per hour at optimal altitude. That 100-mile-per-hour gap was the difference between being a hunter and being prey. Allied pilots developed tactics to counter the jets, catch them on takeoff or landing when they were slow and vulnerable, use altitude advantage to dive on them, force them into turning fights where the Mustang's superior maneuverability gave you a chance. But in level flight, if an ME-262 wanted to kill you and you didn't have a cloud to hide in, you were dead. The tactics worked sometimes. Pilots like Chuck Yeager proved you could kill jets with propeller fighters. But tactics required opportunity, and in early 1945, the Luftwaffe was getting desperate enough to throw ME-262s at bomber formations in broad daylight. When a jet came at you straight and level, all the tactics in the world didn't matter if you couldn't match its speed. By March 1945, the 8th and 15th Air Forces were losing fighters to ME-262s at a rate that was small in percentage terms, but psychologically devastating. It wasn't the numbers that hurt morale, it was the helplessness. Pilots who'd dogfought Me-109s and beaten Focke-Wulf 190s found themselves running from jets and knowing they couldn't run fast enough. That's where Anthony DeMarco enters the story, and where the rebellion against engine specifications began. DeMarco wasn't supposed to be modifying fighter engines. His assignment was routine maintenance on P-51 seconds at Foulmere, a fighter base outside Cambridge. Change spark plugs, adjust valve clearances, replace oil filters, and keep the Packard Merlin engines running according to the technical orders that specified exactly how everything should work. DeMarco had read those technical orders. He'd also spent 3 years before the war building racing engines for modified stock cars at Thompson Speedway in Connecticut, where the rule was simple: make it fast or go home. The technical knowledge he'd gained in those years taught him something the Army Air Forces apparently didn't emphasize in their engine schools. Engines were compromises. Factory specifications were designed for reliability, longevity, and idiot-proof operation. Racing specifications were designed for performance, and if you understood the compromises, you could shift the balance. The Packard Merlin V16507 engine in a P-51D was a beautiful piece of engineering. 12 cylinders, supercharged, producing 1,490 horsepower at war emergency power. It was also running at spark timing and fuel mixture settings that prioritized engine life over maximum power. Packard didn't want engines failing after 50 hours. They wanted them running for 200 hours between overhauls. That meant conservative spark advance curves, slightly rich fuel mixtures, and manifold pressure limits that kept cylinder pressures well below the point where detonation would destroy pistons. DeMarco understood all of this because he'd built engines where the goal wasn't 200 hours between overhauls. The goal was surviving one race. And in late January 1945, when he watched a pilot come back from a mission talking about being chased by a jet and having no option except to dive and pray, DeMarco started thinking about what a Merlin could do if you stopped caring about engine longevity. The key was spark timing. In a piston engine, spark timing controls when the spark plugs fire relative to the piston position. Fire too early, and you get detonation, pre-ignition, and destroyed pistons. Fire too late, and you lose power because the fuel burns inefficiently. Packard's timing curve. For the Merlin was set to fire the spark at about 28 degrees before top dead center at high RPM and manifold pressure. That was conservative, safe, but not optimal for maximum power. DeMarco knew from racing engines that you could advance spark timing to 35, even 38 degrees before top dead center if you were willing to accept two things. First, engine life would drop dramatically because you were operating closer to the edge of detonation. Second, you needed high-octane fuel to prevent knock. The Army Air Forces was already using 150-octane fuel by 1945, fuel that was far better than what was available in civilian racing. That fuel could handle more aggressive timing. What would happen if you advanced spark timing on a Merlin from 28 degrees to 36 degrees? More power. How much more? DeMarco did the calculations in a notebook that would never appear in official maintenance logs. Theory said maybe 15% more power, possibly 20% if you also leaned out the fuel mixture and increased manifold pressure. 15% more power on a 1490 horsepower engine meant an extra 200 horsepower. 200 horsepower translated to maybe 25, 30 miles per hour more airspeed, enough to make a P-51 fast enough to at least run from a jet instead of being a sitting duck. The problem was that advancing spark timing required modifying the magnetos, the electrical generators that powered the spark plugs. Magnetos on a Merlin were precisely timed units sealed by the manufacturer. Tampering with them violated technical orders, voided warranties, and would absolutely result in a court-martial if the engine failed, and investigators traced it back to unauthorized modifications. DeMarco spent 2 weeks in January 1945 thinking about this. Then he stopped thinking and started modifying. His first test case was a P-51D that had been a deadline for minor hydraulic issues. While the hydraulic system was being repaired, DeMarco pulled the magnetos and brought them to his workspace after hours. Magneto timing was controlled by the position of the points relative to the rotor. Advancing timing meant changing that relationship. DeMarco carefully disassembled both magnetos, measured the original point gap and timing position, then modified the point mounting plates to shift timing by 8 degrees. He reassembled everything, tested the magnetos on a bench tester to verify they were generating proper spark, then reinstalled them in the fighter. The modification took 6 hours and left no visible external evidence. Unless you pulled the magnetos and disassembled them, you'd never know they'd been modified. But DeMarco wasn't done. Advancing spark timing alone would help, but the Merlin could produce even more power if you increased manifold pressure. War emergency power was limited to 67 inches of mercury on the manifold pressure gauge. That limit existed to prevent overboost conditions that could damage the engine. But the actual mechanical limit of the supercharger was higher. DeMarco modified the wastegate control system, the mechanism that bled off excess boost pressure, by installing a manual bypass that pilots could activate. When engaged, the bypass allowed manifold pressure to climb to 75 inches, well into territory that Packard's engineers would have called catastrophic overboost. He installed a toggle switch on the left console, unmarked, that controlled both the modified timing and the wastegate bypass. Flip the switch, and you got maximum spark advance plus maximum boost. The combination would produce maximum power. It would also probably destroy the engine in under 5 minutes from detonation or overheating. But 5 minutes of extreme power was all you needed to outrun a jet. By mid-February, DeMarco had quietly modified 3 P-51 seconds in his squadron. He briefed the pilots off the record, explaining that the modification existed, how to use it, and that it was completely unauthorized. Use it only if you're about to die anyway, because it might kill the engine. But better a dead engine than a dead pilot. The first combat test came on February 24, 1945, when Lieutenant Thomas Morrison encountered an ME-262 over Frankfurt. Morrison was escorting B-17 seconds when the jet appeared at his 6 o'clock, closing fast. He flipped DeMarco's toggle switch and felt his Mustang surge forward. The airspeed indicator climbed from 440 to 465. The jet was still faster, but not by enough to close the gap before Morrison reached cloud cover. Morrison landed at Foulmere with an engine that was running rough, overheating, and showing signs of incipient detonation damage. DeMarco pulled the engine that night and found cracked pistons in 3 cylinders. The engine was junk, but Morrison was alive. Word spread. Pilots started asking DeMarco if their fighters could get the modification. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By early March, DeMarco had modified 11 P-51 seconds, working night shifts to avoid attention from officers who might ask uncomfortable questions about what he was doing. And those 11 fighters were coming back from encounters with ME-262s at a rate that was statistically improbable. Captain Harrigan's encounter on March 14th was the one that brought everything into the open. Because Harrigan didn't just survive. He turned around and chased the jet. When Harrigan felt his Mustang accelerate past 460 miles per hour, something clicked in his fighter pilot brain. The instinct that said, if you can catch it, you can kill it. The ME-262 pilot had broken off and dived away, probably assuming the American fighter couldn't follow. Harrigan followed. At 468 miles per hour, his modified Mustang stayed on the jet's tail through a dive from 18,000 feet to 12,000. The German pilot pulled up hard, using the jet's thrust to climb away. But climbing burned energy, and Harrigan was right behind him, his modified engine still screaming at power levels that should have torn the supercharger apart. At 14,000 feet, the jet ran out of airspeed in the climb. For maybe 3 seconds, the ME-262 hung in the air, slow enough that Harrigan's 650 caliber machine guns could reach out and touch it. He fired a 2-second burst. 53 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary tore into the jet's left engine. The Jumo turbojet didn't explode like a piston engine would have, it just disintegrated. Turbine blades shed at 15,000 RPM, shredding the engine casing and sending fragments through the wing structure. The ME-262 snap-rolled left and entered a flat spin that no amount of pilot skill could recover from. Harrigan watched it fall, then looked at his engine gauges and realized he'd been running DeMarco's modification for nearly 4 minutes. Cylinder head temperature was 50 degrees past redline. Oil temperature was critical. Manifold pressure was at 76 inches, higher than he'd ever seen. He released the toggle switch, felt the engine settle back to normal power, and prayed it wouldn't seize before he got home. It didn't seize, but when DeMarco pulled the cowling that evening, he found an engine that was on borrowed time. Cracked cylinders, scored cylinder walls, a supercharger bearing that was about to fail. The engine had maybe 10 more hours before catastrophic failure, but Harrigan had killed an ME-262 in level flight, which was supposed to be impossible. By March 16th, the word had reached Group Command. Major Robert Chen, the squadron engineering officer, showed up at DeMarco's maintenance area and asked to see exactly what modifications had been done. Chen was an interesting character. He'd been an automotive engineer at Chrysler before the war, working on the experimental Thunderbolt racing car program. He understood high-performance engines, and he understood the compromises between reliability and power. When DeMarco showed him the modified magnetos and explained the spark timing advance, Chen didn't immediately call for a court-martial. Instead, he asked a question. How much power are you actually getting? DeMarco pulled out his grease-stained notebook. Based on manifold pressure, RPM, and airspeed data from 3 pilots, I'm estimating 210 to 240 additional horsepower at full modification. That's pushing 1,700 total horsepower. Chen did the math. Packard's engineers would say that's impossible without grenading the engine. DeMarco's response was simple. Packard's engineers prioritize engines lasting 200 hours. I prioritize pilots not getting killed by jets. How many hours is your modification good for? Maybe 5 hours of total cumulative use at full power. Then the engine needs overhaul or replacement. Chen looked at the numbers, looked at the modified engine, then made a command decision that probably saved 50 lives. He authorized DeMarco to continue modifications, but with engineering oversight. Chen would instrument the next test aircraft with additional temperature and pressure sensors to document exactly what was happening inside the engine, and they would develop operational guidelines for when and how pilots should use the modification. The goal wasn't to make this standard practice. The goal was to give pilots a survival option when facing jets. Between March 16th and March 28th, Chen and DeMarco worked together on refining the modification. They discovered several critical factors that improved reliability. First, the modification worked best at altitudes above 15,000 feet, where colder air temperatures helped cooling. Second, limiting use to 90-second bursts significantly reduced the risk of catastrophic detonation. Third, pilots needed to enrich the fuel mixture slightly when engaging the modification to provide additional cooling. Chen documented everything in a technical report that he forwarded to 8th Air Force engineering staff on March 30th. The report was careful in its language, describing the modification as an emergency power system for jet interception rather than admitting it was technically illegal field modification of engine specifications. The response from 8th Air Force headquarters came on April 2nd. It was not what they expected. Instead of authorization or condemnation, it was a request for immediate demonstration. A team of engineering officers would arrive at Foulmere on April 5th to witness flight testing and review technical data. April 5th, 1945, was overcast with low clouds, not ideal for flight testing. But the engineering team from 8th Air Force headquarters wasn't interested in weather. They were interested in whether a propeller-driven fighter could actually match jet performance. The team was led by Colonel David Hartman, who'd been an aeronautical engineer at Wright Field before the war. Hartman had a reputation for being simultaneously brilliant and difficult. He believed in engineering data, not anecdotes, and he'd killed more than one promising modification program because the numbers didn't support the claims. DeMarco spent 2 hours walking Hartman through the technical details. Magneto timing curves, supercharger boost characteristics, cylinder pressure calculations. Hartman listened, asked pointed questions about detonation margins and thermal limits, then asked to see flight test data. Chen had that ready. 5 P-51 seconds with the modification had flown 15 sorties since March 16th. All 5 had engaged ME-262s at some point. 3 had successfully evaded. 2 had engaged and damaged jets. Engine failure rate was 40%. 2 of the 5 engines had required replacement after exceeding thermal or pressure limits, but 0 pilots lost. Hartman studied the data in silence, then asked the question that mattered. You're killing engines to save pilots. That's the trade-off? Chen's answer was immediate. Yes, sir. And given that replacing an engine takes our mechanics 8 hours versus training a replacement pilot takes 6 months, it's a trade we'll make every time. Hartman surprised everyone by nodding. All right, let's see it fly. The test pilot was Captain Richard Vance, who'd flown P-51 seconds since 1943 and had 3 ME-262 encounters, all of which had ended with him running away because he couldn't match jet speed. Vance took off at 1300 hours in a modified Mustang, call sign Sugar Baker 6, with instructions to climb to 20,000 feet and demonstrate maximum speed in level flight. Normal procedure first, then with modification engaged. At 20,000 feet, Vance pushed to war emergency power. Airspeed stabilized at 438 miles per hour. He radioed down to the tower. Speed without modification, 438. Then he flipped DeMarco's toggle switch. The Mustang accelerated like it had been kicked, 445. 455. 463. 470. At 472 miles per hour, the airspeed stopped climbing. Vance held that speed for 60 seconds, watching engine gauges climb into ranges that made him nervous, then released the toggle. Speed with modification, 472. Engine temperatures critical but stable. Hartman watched from the tower, binoculars tracking the Mustang as it screamed across the sky at speeds that weren't supposed to be possible for a propeller fighter. He turned to Chen and asked the most important question. "What's the ME-262's cruise speed?" "About 500 miles per hour, sir, but they slow down in combat maneuvering. 472 miles per hour. Chen nodded. "At 472, we can chase them. At 440, we run away. That's the difference between being helpless and having a chance." Hartman made a decision that would ripple through every fighter group in Europe. He authorized field implementation of the modification as an emergency measure, with 3 critical restrictions. First, use limited to jet interception scenarios only. Second, cumulative use not to exceed 5 minutes per engine before mandatory inspection. Third, modification must be performed by certified engine mechanics following Chen and DeMarco's technical specifications. The authorization came with a footnote that was pure military bureaucracy. This modification is considered experimental field expedient and does not constitute approval for standard operational use. Translation: We're allowing this because it works, but if it goes wrong, we're blaming the field. Commanders? April 1945. While the official authorization was being typed up and distributed through proper channels, something else was happening across fighter bases in England and Italy. Mechanics were talking to each other. Technical Sergeant Michael Russo at Debden had heard about DeMarco's modification through a crew chief who'd visited Falmere on a parts run. By April 8th, Russo was replicating the magneto-timing advance on P-51 seconds in the 4th Fighter Group. He didn't wait for authorization. He'd watched too many pilots come back talking about jets they couldn't catch. Staff Sergeant James Lee at Lesina, flying base for the 15th Air Force's P-51 units in Italy, learned about it through a pilot who'd transferred from England. Lee was modifying fighters by April 12th, using techniques he'd learned building racing engines in California before the war. The modification spread through informal networks, mechanic to mechanic, following the same pattern that had spread Zook's B-17 modifications a year earlier. Grassroots engineering revolution while headquarters debated committee structures. By late April, an estimated 75 P-51 seconds across both European and Mediterranean theatres were running DeMarco's modification. The official number, aircraft modified under the new authorization, was 18. The gap represented mechanics who looked at regulations, looked at dead pilots, and made the same choice DeMarco had made. Fix it now, document it later. The combat results started appearing in after-action reports in ways that intelligence analysts couldn't ignore. The 352nd Fighter Group, which had been avoiding jet engagements due to speed disadvantage, started reporting successful interceptions. On April 19th, 3 modified P-51 seconds from the 352nd engaged 4 ME-262s over Berlin. The jets scattered when they realized the Mustangs could match their speed. No kills, but the psychological impact was significant. German pilots who'd grown accustomed to being untouchable suddenly found themselves being chased. April 22nd, Lieutenant James Morrison, the same pilot who'd first tested DeMarco's modification in February, caught an ME-262 during takeoff from an airfield near Munich. The jet was accelerating through 300 miles per hour when Morrison dove on it with his modification engaged. At 465 miles per hour in a 15-degree dive, Morrison closed to 200 yards and fired a 3-second burst. The jet exploded, probably hit in a fuel tank. Morrison pulled up, his engine screaming in protest, and felt something seize in the supercharger. He shut down immediately, dead-sticked the Mustang to a crash landing in Allied territory, and walked away with minor injuries. The engine was destroyed, but another ME-262 was gone. Colonel Hartman compiled statistics through late April that told the story in numbers. Modified P-51 seconds had a 47% success rate in jet engagement scenarios, where success meant either killing the jet, damaging it, or forcing it to break off. Unmodified P-51 seconds had a 9% success rate in the same scenarios, almost entirely from advantageous bounce attacks. The modification worked, but it came at a cost. Engine attrition rate for modified aircraft was running at 60%. 6 out of every 10 engines run at full modification power required replacement within 30 hours of flight time. That should have been unacceptable. But the Air Force was doing the same calculation Chen had done. Engines were replaceable, pilots weren't. In late April 1945, the air war over Germany was entering its final phase. The Luftwaffe was nearly destroyed, but the jets were still out there. ME-262s operating from hidden airfields, striking bomber formations and disappearing before escorts could respond. The modification couldn't change the overall strategic picture, but it changed the tactical equation for individual pilots who found themselves facing the future of aviation with engines designed in the 1930s. May 1, 1945. Lieutenant Robert Taylor from the 357th Fighter Group was escorting B-17 seconds to a synthetic oil plant at Brucks when 4 ME-262s appeared at his squadron's 6 o'clock position. Taylor was flying a modified P-51D. He'd been briefed on the modification, practiced using it once during a test flight, and had been told to save it for emergencies. 4 jets attacking 12 fighters qualified as an emergency. Taylor broke right, flipped the toggle switch DeMarco had pioneered, and felt his Mustang surge forward. The lead ME-262 had been lining up on Taylor's wingman when Taylor's fighter suddenly accelerated into firing position. At 460 miles per hour, Taylor closed to 300 yards and fired. His first burst missed. The jet pilot, reacting to tracer fire, broke left into a hard turn. Jets could turn, but not as tightly as Mustangs. Taylor followed through the turn, his modification still engaged, his airspeed dropping through 420 as the turn bled off energy, but he was inside the jet's turning circle. At 250 yards, Taylor fired again. This time he connected. 50 caliber rounds stitched across the ME-262's right engine. The turbine failed explosively, sending fragments through the fuselage. The jet rolled inverted and went down. Taylor pulled out of the turn, released the modification toggle, and checked his engine gauges. Cylinder head temperature was 70 degrees over redline. Oil pressure was dropping. He'd pushed the engine past its limits, and it was dying. Taylor nursed the Mustang back to base, the engine running rough but still producing power. He landed successfully, taxied to the maintenance area, and shut down. When the engine stopped, it made a sound like metal tearing. The supercharger had seized. DeMarco, who'd been summoned to examine the engine, pronounced it dead on arrival. Connecting rods had cracked. Pistons had scoured cylinder walls. The supercharger bearing had welded itself solid. The engine had given Taylor everything it had, then given up. But Taylor was alive, and one more ME-262 was gone. The combat reports from the first week of May 1945 showed a pattern that validated everything DeMarco had risked court-martial to achieve. 23 confirmed encounters between modified P-51 seconds and ME-262s. 11 jets destroyed or damaged. 4 P-51 seconds lost, 3 to flak, 1 to engine failure during modification use. Engine replacement rate, 73%. 0 pilots lost in jet engagements. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. The modification had been in operational use for less than 8 weeks. In that time, it had changed the calculus of jet interception from impossible to possible. It hadn't won the war. The war was already won, but it had given pilots facing the future of aviation a fighting chance using engines from the past. June 1945. With the war over, the Army Air Forces conducted formal engineering analysis of DeMarco's modification to determine whether it should be incorporated into standard P-51 operations going forward. The analysis was conducted at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, using a test cell engine that was instrumented with dozens of sensors to measure exactly what happened when you advanced spark timing and increased boost pressure beyond specifications. The results were technically fascinating and operationally damning. The modification did exactly what DeMarco had claimed. It increased power output from 1,490 horsepower to approximately 1,720 horsepower at peak. That power came at the cost of cylinder pressures that exceeded original design margins by 32%. Detonation risk increased, exponentially above 90 seconds of continuous use. Engine life, even without detonation, was reduced to approximately 40% of normal. The engineering conclusion was clear. The modification worked, but it was unsuitable for standard operational use because it sacrificed engine longevity for short-term performance. The Air Force's response was equally clear. Archive the technical data, document the modification for future reference, and return P-51 engines to standard specifications now that the jet threat was gone. By August 1945, most of the modified P-51 seconds had their engines replaced during routine maintenance. The magnetos were returned to factory timing, the wastegate modifications were removed, the toggle switches that had given pilots emergency power were disconnected and eventually removed. Anthony DeMarco mustered out of the Army Air Forces in October 1945 with the rank of Technical Sergeant, a commendation for exceptional technical proficiency, and no official recognition of the modification that had changed jet interception tactics. He went back to Providence, opened a speed shop specializing in racing engines, and spent the next 30 years building performance engines for drag racers and stock car drivers. He never talked much about the war. In 1972, an Air Force historian named Dr. Patricia Denning was researching fighter tactics against ME-262s, when she found references in after-action reports to P-51 seconds, achieving unusually high speeds during jet encounters. The reports mentioned field modifications but provided no technical details. She tracked down the original source through maintenance logs and found DeMarco in Providence, running DeMarco racing engines. Denning spent 2 days interviewing DeMarco and reviewing the personal notebooks he'd kept, grease-stained pages filled with timing curves, pressure calculations, and notes about which pilots had used the modification successfully. She asked why he'd risked court-martial to make unauthorized modifications. DeMarco's answer, recorded in Denning's research notes, was characteristically direct. Pilots were getting killed by jets they couldn't catch. I knew how to make their engines faster. Didn't seem complicated. The modification that DeMarco had pioneered never became standard practice, but it influenced post-war fighter engine development in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The F-86 Sabre, America's first swept-wing jet fighter, included variable timing controls that allowed pilots to trade engine life for performance in emergency situations. The principle was the same: give pilots the option to push beyond normal limits when their lives depended on it. The P-51 Mustang that DeMarco first modified, the fighter with the deadline hydraulic system that became his test case, survived the war and was eventually sold as surplus in 1957. It went through several private owners, before ending up in a restoration shop in California in 1984. The restoration crew, cleaning decades of corrosion from the engine, found something unusual. The magnetos had been modified, timing advanced beyond factory specifications. They returned the magnetos to standard timing because that's what restoration meant, return to factory original condition. But they photographed the modifications first, and those photographs ended up in the Air Force Museum Research Archives, labeled Field Expedient Modification of Unknown Origin. Anthony DeMarco died in 1994 at age 73. His obituary in the Providence Journal noted he'd been a veteran and had run a successful racing engine business for decades. No mention of P-51 seconds or ME-262s or the modification that had given propeller fighters a chance against jets. His personal maintenance notebooks, the unofficial record of every engine he'd modified, were donated to the Air Force Museum after his death. They sit in the research archives now, 43 notebooks filled with timing curves, boost calculations, and annotations in a mechanic's shorthand that document how one man's knowledge of racing engines changed the odds for pilots who never knew his name. The forbidden modification became a footnote. The Maverick became a name in archive files. And the lesson that sometimes the solution to technological disadvantage isn't better technology, but better understanding of the technology you have, remains relevant every time someone faces an impossible problem and refuses to accept. That impossible means impossible. In the end, DeMarco's modification saved an estimated 30 to 40 pilots who would have been killed by ME-262s they couldn't outrun. That number is small compared to the overall scope of the air war in Europe. But those 30 to 40 pilots went home. They had families, careers, lives that extended decades past 1945. And none of it would have happened if one mechanic from Providence hadn't looked at an engine that was supposed to be at its limits and asked, "What if it's not?" That simple question, half curiosity, half defiance, was the difference between men returning home and not returning at all. It began not in a factory or design bureau, but in a cold dispersal hut outside a muddy airfield in western Germany, where oil smoke clung to everything and the sound of engines never really stopped. The Messerschmitt ME-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, represented the cutting edge, the future of aviation. It was sleek, fast, untouchable in level flight, and terrifying in a dive. The Luftwaffe pilots who flew it knew they were witnessing the dawn of a new era. The Allied pilots facing it knew it too, and they feared it. The ME-262 could run rings around their Mustangs and Thunderbolts, outclimb and outdive anything with a propeller. Its speed gave German pilots brief, illusory moments of superiority in an air war they had already lost. Yet in the spring of 1945, during those last brutal months of the war over Europe, it wasn't the ME-262 that defined the air battles. It was the persistence of the old war horses. The piston-engine fighters, the prop-driven aircraft designed a decade earlier, still filled the skies. Their pilots, and the ground crews who kept them alive, refused to concede to the jet age before its time. Among those ground crews was Sergeant Joseph Joe DeMarco, a self-taught mechanic from Providence, Rhode Island. DeMarco was the kind of man who had grease under his fingernails even on Sundays, who could tell an engine's condition by the pitch of its idle, and who distrusted engineers who'd never held a wrench. He wasn't supposed to make design changes. He wasn't even supposed to think about them. The manuals were clear, the specifications sacred, and deviation was a court-martial offense. But DeMarco had seen too many young pilots die because a regulation told them when to throttle back or when to cut fuel flow. When reports started coming in that the ME-262 seconds were cutting through bomber formations before the escorts could react, DeMarco didn't blame the pilots, he blamed the hardware. He knew the P-47 Thunderbolt's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could take more punishment than the books claimed. The engineers in Hartford had designed it with a safety margin. DeMarco had seen the test figures scrawled in a forgotten appendix. He knew there was power left untapped, So he began experimenting, quietly, after hours. A few adjustments to the supercharger bypass, a modification to the intercooler line, a fuel mixture richer than recommended. Each change pushed the engine closer to the edge of detonation, but each one also wrung out a few more knots of speed. He ran the numbers in his head, checked the plugs, listened to the metal. Then, when a trusted pilot, Lieutenant Harris, barely 22, asked what he'd done, DeMarco simply said, "She'll climb like she's angry now. Don't baby her." The next day, Harris shot down a jet. The squadron's mood changed overnight. The myth of the untouchable ME-262 cracked. The pilots started to believe that their prop fighters could still fight the future and win. They came back to DeMarco with requests, tweaks, questions, demands. Could he do the same to their engines? Could he push theirs too? DeMarco obliged, though every change carried risk. The engines were running hotter, the wear increased. There were failures, 2 aircraft lost to engine fires, 1 crash landing after a supercharger seizure. But even those failures were lessons, not deterrents. DeMarco documented everything in a small notebook he kept in his pocket, writing in shorthand to keep the inspectors ignorant. To him, the danger wasn't reckless, it was necessary. The war wasn't being fought in laboratories or offices. It was being fought at treetop height, under fire, with seconds to live or die. That was DeMarco's true gift, not the mechanical insight alone, but the understanding that when the choice is between regulations and reality, reality wins, every time. He knew that a rule written in peacetime could kill men in wartime. He believed the manual was a guideline, not gospel. And while others debated ethics or protocol, DeMarco turned wrenches until the metal itself became an ally. In April 1945, his modifications saved an entire bomber group. The story would later circulate quietly among veterans, but never appear in official reports. A swarm of Me-262 seconds attacked the formation near Regensburg. The escorts, flying DeMarco's modified Thunderbolts, accelerated faster than command thought possible. They intercepted the jets before they reached the bombers, shooting down 4 in a single engagement. The surviving German pilots radioed in disbelief they'd been caught by supersonic props. When the war ended, DeMarco went home to Providence. He never sought recognition. He opened a small auto shop, married a nurse, raised 2 daughters, and rarely spoke of what he'd done. To most, he was just another returning veteran. But to the men who flew his planes, he was something else entirely, the mechanic who refused to accept limits. The irony was that within 5 years, jets truly did dominate the skies. The Me-262 had been a glimpse of the inevitable, yet that didn't diminish what DeMarco had done. His work wasn't about resisting progress. It was about bridging the gap between eras, proving that courage and ingenuity could still matter in the face of technology. And perhaps that's the real legacy of those months in 1945. The story of DeMarco isn't just about an engine modification. It's about the stubborn refusal to give in to inevitability. It's about men who understood that even when the future is bearing down on you at 600 miles per hour, you can still fight back with skill, grit, and a touch of defiance. The families that grew from those who returned, the children who were born because their fathers lived another day, the quiet lives built after chaos all trace back, in some small, invisible way, to that one question: what if it's not? What if the limit isn't real? DeMarco never patented anything, never published his notes. When he died in 1983, his daughters found his wartime logbook, the one filled with shorthand entries and fuel ratios. They donated it to the Smithsonian's Air and Space Archive. A curator once remarked that the entries read less like engineering data and more like a philosophy. Don't trust the manual when you can trust the machine. History doesn't remember men like DeMarco with medals or headlines. Their contributions live in the margins, in the performance numbers that don't quite match the official specs, in the stories pilots tell in hangars decades later. They were the bridge between the known and the possible. And in that smoky airfield in the spring of 1945, when the old propeller-driven warbirds clawed their way into the sky to meet the sleek jet predators, it wasn't just a battle between machines, it was a test of belief. DeMarco believed that the past still had something to say to the future. He proved it in fire and oil and courage. The men he saved went on to live ordinary, extraordinary lives. They built homes, raised children, walked streets filled with the hum of peacetime industry. They watched the jet age arrive, but they never forgot the roar of a prop engine pushed just past its limit, the sound of survival made possible by one man who refused to accept that the future had already won. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.